Some of you may have heard this before, but don't let that fool you. Just because you've heard a story before doesn't make it any less true. Every legend, even urban legends, started with a bit of truth. Something happened. All legends started somewhere. And as a folklorist, I study where they began. But this story I heard long before I became a folklorist, long before I became a storyteller. I was a lead Cub Scout. And the evil people who told me this story said it was that tree right there. That's where it happened. Later on, I discovered it happened just about everywhere. There's one that's happened right up this very canyon. I found one that wasn't a tree but a statue in Central Park. I found one that was a lifeguard station on an LA beach. But all the stories have similar things, and they're all connected. And the story starts at a high school dance, where two teenagers came out of the dance together. Now, I noticed a group of young people who came in as the show started. Have you ever wondered why it's always teenagers and young college kids that are always in these stories? It's simple. It's because you're still stupid. No, seriously, if you look at these more mature people in the room, if they walked into a haunted house and they heard a voice say, "Get out," they would. But a teenager would look up at the voice and say, "You're not the boss of me." These two teenagers had gone to the dance with other people. But during the course of the dance, they found themselves much more interesting and stimulating to each other, and so they ditched their dates. And the boy offered to take the girl for a ride in his car, an old 1970s land boat. Now he bought the car for one reason and one reason only. The back seat was the size of a living room couch. And that's also the reason why the young lady agreed to take a ride. And they drove up the canyon to a legendary spot, a spot where lots of people would go and park their cars. And it was perfect for such an activity because it was very large and the branches hung down low. So even on a bright moon night, you almost had to bump into the car before you realized it was there. It was so dark. And they drove up and they parked the car, and the young man turned off the engine and turned on the radio for a little mood music. They adjourned to the back seat to get to know each other better. Things were going well. They were having a good time. When suddenly the music was cut off by an announcer's voice announcing that the homicidal axe murderer had just escaped from the state institution and was suspected to be headed straight to their canyon, because that is where he had been captured before. And then the music resumed. The young man thought that was interesting and wanted to commence with the activity, but the young lady would have nothing of it. I'm not going to stay here in a canyon with a murderer on the loose. Don't you remember all the reports of the atrocious things he did? The young man said, the institution is a 3-hour drive away. If he's on foot, it'll take him days to get here. We're perfectly safe. Come on. But she would have nothing to do with it. And the argument commenced back and forth. I do not want to stay in a canyon with an extra murderer on the loose. You're fine, it's so safe. But, of course, she won. And he agreed to take her home. So he climbed back into the front seat. He turned the key. But if any of you have ever driven an older model car, when you leave the radio on with the engine off, it's not a good thing. As he turned the key, instead of the engine roaring to life, the light on the radio just dimmed out. The battery was dead. They were going nowhere. He was fine with the boy. He wanted to get back into the back seat, but she would have nothing to do with it. We can't stay here in the canyon with an axe murderer on the loose. He said, well, we have a choice. We can, we can walk out. Some of the summer cabins might still have some people. There might be a phone there since we can't get reception up here. I'm not walking through a canyon with an axe murderer on the loose, she said. All right, let's stay here in the car. Well, I'm not staying in this canyon with an axe murderer on the loose. You have to choose one or the other. You either have to stay or walk out. A compromise was reached. It was decided that she would stay in the car. He pulled the emergency blanket out of the back seat, and it was so dark underneath the tree that if she laid on that large back seat and they put the blanket over the top of her, even if you pressed your face against the glass, you couldn't tell she was in the car. The boy said, "I'll walk for help. You lay under the blanket. Nobody will see you. When I come back, I'll pound on the top of the car 3 times and say your name. And then you'll know it's me and it's safe." And so she laid under that blanket, terrified, remembering all the images of what this man had done. And she listened to the boy's footsteps walk away in the dirt. And she waited. There was no sound that she could hear. It was dark and warm under that blanket. And even though she was terrified, eventually the warmth and the night caught up to her and she fell asleep. She awoke to the pounding on the roof. But it kept pounding. It kept pounding. Her name was not called. It started to move around the car, on the roof, on the hood, on the roof, on the trunk. She shivered. She didn't know who was outside of the car. It could have been other teenagers wanting the spot. It could have been the ex-murderer trying to flush her out. But she stayed under the blanket, not moving, as quiet as she could. "You can't see me, you can't see me, you can't see me." Suddenly, the back end of the car thrust down as if somebody had climbed up onto the trunk. And she heard the footsteps go up the long trunk, up onto the glass, and she heard the roof of the car collapse under the weight of some person. And they walked on top of the car for a while, and she stayed perfectly still. And suddenly, the car released. And she heard footsteps walking away in the dirt into the night. She listened carefully. Was he going to come back for her? Was he just luring her out? She trembled underneath that blanket, and as it got really quiet, she noticed that there was a sound left behind. It was a strange scratching on the roof. Like they'd broken a branch off the tree and it was now brushing the roof of the car with every breeze. She stayed there listening, until the warmth and the night caught her again, and she fell asleep. She awoke to the sound of men's voices, lots of men's voices outside of the car, and she stayed perfectly still until she heard a radio, somebody speaking on top, or a walkie-talkie that said, "Confirm, sending the bus." And she knew immediately it had to be the police. So very carefully she lifted the blanket and saw that it was morning, and there was a police officer standing right outside of her window. In her excitement, she threw the blanket off, and the police officer saw her and freaked out. He had not seen her in the car, and he tried to open the door, but of course it was locked. He yelled at her to unlock the door, and she did, and he opened the door and pulled her out roughly from the car and started to drag him over to his truck off to the side. He was asking her questions. "Who are you? Why are you here? What is going on?" She, being a teenage girl, did not like this rough treatment. And she pulled away and said, "I gotta get my stuff out of the car!" And she turned back to the car. And hanging by his ankles from a branch in the car was the boy. His throat had been slit, and his fingernails were rubbing against the roof of the car. She fell to her knees. She fell to her knees trembling, and she shouted, "Did you get him? Did you get him?" The police officer asked, "Get who? Who are you talking about?" The axe-murderer, the escaped lunatic. Did you catch him?" "Yeah," he said. We caught him a half a mile away from the institution, laying in a ditch. We were hoping you could tell us who did this. The story has been told far and wide for a very long time, in many, many different places. But every legend started somewhere.